Hey guys, it's Chai, your professional poker coach. If you do not have a robust flop c-bet strategy, you're simply losing money. Playing well on the flop sets you up for playing good on the turn and on the river. So this is the easiest way to actually lose a lot of money playing poker. It's not playing effectively here. Effective flop play is actually insanely difficult in poker, but I've done my best to distill everything down for you into this video. So I rely on my thousands of hours of experience to actually teach you guys this information. Not only will you guys learn the theoretical flop strategy, but you'll also learn how to shift it exploitatively, which helps my students crush and feel like winners. So let's have a look here. This is button versus big blind, random flop. So a lot of people who come to me might have a basic understanding of what to do here, but not a well thought out strategy. For me, a well thought out strategy always starts with the pro poker thought process. And honestly, as I make more and more videos, you're going to hear me reference this exact thought process more and more. So it's super, super vital. It's important we understand it. Whenever we get to a poker spot, we want to ask 3 questions. The first question is quite simply, what is the overall betting frequency here? So this is going to be the Nash overall betting frequency. The reason why this one is important is because it informs a lot of decisions that we'll have with hands, as we'll see later in this video today. The next question you want to ask yourself is, what is the betting frequency with my hand? So in the first question, we addressed what is the overall betting frequency with your range, right? That gives you a really good broad overview of what to do in the spot. And then the second one gets a lot more specific, and that one is based on a few patterns that we're going to explore today. So in a way, both of those questions are just answering what is the Nash equilibrium strategy. We're starting with the most broad one, and then we're getting specific. Super important that we follow this thought process, because we're going to look at how hand classes individually play as a function of the overall betting frequency, which is going to be determined by the range versus range interaction of the players. So very important that we dissect it this way. The third final question is, what is the exploitative way to play? In poker, we're obviously trying to exploit our opponents in order to make the most amount of money. So we need to know which way do our hands prefer to deviate, right? Do we prefer to bet them, or maybe do we prefer to check them? And again, in this video, I'm going to teach you guys what is the best way to play with a lot of your hands on the flop. So tons of value here. So let's go back to this hand here. The first question we wanted to answer is, what is the overall betting frequency here? And again, this is going to inform our future questions. So the answer to this question really just boils down to the range versus range interaction. This includes things like position as well as range tightness, right? So are we playing early positions? Are we playing late positions? Are we in position? Are we out of position? It's just the way the solver comes to the conclusion. And obviously, range versus range interactions are meaningless without the board. So we have to pay attention to what the board is to understand what the overall betting frequency is. And I like to break things down into a few different board categories, which we're going to explore today. To keep things super, super simple for the video, I've divided the flop into just a few categories. We're going to look at high connected boards, we're going to look at high disconnected boards, low boards, and then paired boards. We'll take an in-depth dive into each so you can really understand the answers to questions 1 and 2. And after I discuss how the solver plays, we're going to talk a little bit about exploits towards the end of the video. Let's go ahead and just dissect all of these boards and start getting into the nitty-gritty. So let's say you're playing on a high connected board from button versus big blind. At multiple points in the video, I'm going to stop it and I'm going to ask you guys the question, what is the overall strategy here? And the overall strategy means, what is the overall bet size used at Nash? And what is the overall betting frequency? I'm asking you guys that question right now. Feel free to pause the video, really think about it. This is the sort of stuff that really helps you with learning. If you want to, you can even comment down your answer below. So I'll let you guys do that. Okay, hopefully you guys have paused the video and try to answer this one. I'm gonna go ahead and answer it too. I'm gonna say that the overall betting frequency here is maybe 40% of the time, and we're mainly using an overbet. So let's just click one of these boxes and then see what our range prefers to do. Okay, that is exactly right. I promise you guys I did not cheat. But let's go into the PowerPoint and just break this overall category down. So on high connected boards, the solver is typically overbetting, and it's only betting around 40% of the time. Going back to this board, you can see that this is exactly how the solver plays. The reason why the solver is using an overbet here is because in late positions, you're going to be checking a lot of under pairs, a lot of second pairs and third pairs, which really don't have an incentive to bet. Your second pairs just have enough showdown value to check, and they don't really gain anything by betting. Instead, as the preflop raiser, you have so many strong hands that want to build the pot in a geometric way. So the preferred strategy is to overbet on the flop, overbet on the turn, and overbet on the river. But there's a few points here. The first point is that from early positions, we can actually range bet for 30% of the pot. For example, if we're playing an under the gun versus big blind and the flop is king jack 6, I let the solver just pick the one single best bet size to use, and it is using the 25% bet size and betting 85% of the time. This only occurs from early positions. In late positions, you're much better off just overbetting if you want to use one bet size. The reason why it's using a small bet size here at a high frequency is simply because in early positions, players' ranges are going to be much more asymmetric. The pre-flop raiser is going to have a range that has very many strong hands in this offsuit Broadway region as well as the suited Broadway region. The pre-flop caller, however, is mainly going to have a lot of low combos like pocket pairs and all these gappers and suited connectors in their range, and they're missing a lot of these strong hands as well. From early positions, the pre-flop raiser can actually capitalize on their range advantage by using a very, very small bet, and then big blind just has no choice but to overfold, right? They're folding around 35% of the time, which is quite often versus a small bet. And under the gun is basically just winning a large share of the pot with a very small size. There's also a note about range tightness here. That's a little bit more technical and I don't want to discuss it just now. And there's one final note I have for you guys. So we are betting less often on ace high flops. If we go back to that early position spot, but change it from king jack 6 to ace jack 6, you can see that the solver is only betting 60% of the time. On ace-high boards, usually both players are going to bet a little bit less often. Ace-high top pairs are going to be a larger chunk of both players' ranges when there's an ace on the board. When both players have a lot of top pairs, their second pairs and under pairs just have to be really, really careful, and that's why you have just a high checking frequency overall. This higher checking frequency comes from the natural tendency to protect a lot of weaker pairs. You also don't really gain protection by betting your top pairs, so that definitely contributes to the higher checking frequency on those boards. So now that we have a very good understanding of just the overall rough strategy from early positions to late positions, let's take a look at how individual hand classes play. And this, of course, is going to answer question 2 that we asked earlier in the pro poker thought process. Just going back to this hand here, we're holding a bluff, but we want to have a really good strategy for when we're holding all sorts of hands in our range. What we're going to do is take a deeper dive into the betting strategy of various hands on similar boards, and then we'll just break it down by hand class. To do that, we're going to use the notes that I wrote in my PowerPoint. So let's see how different hand classes bet on high connected boards. First, we're going to start with our strong hands. These are going to be our 2 pairs plus, our over pairs, and our top pairs. On these high connected boards, they are almost always going to be betting on the flop. 2 pairs plus, over pairs always betting, and then top pairs are going to bet around 50% of the time. The strongest ones have priority. Here you can see that our sets are going to be betting almost always, our 2 pairs are going to be betting almost always, and then the stronger top pairs are almost always going to be betting, but as they get weaker and weaker, there's going to be a drop-off to a point where they eventually just check. There's going to be a tiny bit of slow playing with strong hands like sets and 2 pairs. These are almost always going to come from combos that block that top card. So pocket aces is going to be really good, and then ace 6 is also going to be a pretty good slow play. If you guys want, I'll make a whole separate video about slow playing some other time on my channel. Now let's have a look at how our medium strength hands are going to play. These are going to be our second pairs and our low pairs. You can see that they're mostly checking, but weaker pairs, especially weak low pairs, can actually bluff. And this becomes a lot more common if that low pair is connected. Going back to this board, you'll see that second pairs are almost always checking, and weak third pairs are also going to be betting. Something like 8-6, 7-6, 6-5, etc. If they have the ability to make a straight, then that becomes even better. But here, obviously, they don't. And last up are going to be our bluffs. So our connected hands are bluffing 70% of the time, and some low showdown value junk can also bluff. Again, just going back here, we're going to select our king highs and no made hands. You'll see that typically we do need some connectivity to bluff. So hands like queen 10 that have a good shot are obviously bluffing a lot more than something like king 9. And we're actually checking king 9 of clubs 100% of the time. So we do need a flush draw in order to bet this combo. But still, you will see that very weak hands like 8-7 of clubs are going to be bluffing at a decent frequency. So in general, you want to prioritize bluffing your draws, but note that some weak bluffs can also bluff like 30-40% of the time. The reason why we're betting king 9 of clubs and we're checking 8-7 of clubs largely has to do with showdown value. A lot of times on the flop, you will bluff combos that have less showdown value. We're going to see that a lot more today. Okay, let's do a little pop quiz for you guys. If we're overbetting on this board, how often do you think King 10 is going to bet? Again, I'll let you guys pause this one, really think about it, comment your answer if you feel inclined, and then resume the video. Hopefully you guys have done that. I'm going to give it my best shot too. I'm going to say this specific combo is going to be betting around 40 to 50% of the time. Let's check it out. Oh, it is betting around 50% of the time. I swear to God, guys, I'm not cheating. This is just the power of doing analysis like this. So if you like this one, subscribe to the video. Hopefully you guys got this right too. I'm sure many of you guys did. And if you really like this video, by the way, I have a really amazing warm-up builder on my website right now. So if you want to take your mental game as seriously as your technical game and really become a poker champion, definitely check that out. The link is in the description. It's 100% free, so go ahead and get your copy. But let's move on to our next category. Our next category are high disconnected boards. These are going to be boards like King 7-3 instead of King Jack 3. So we want to see a big gap between those first two cards. And our best betting strategy here is going to be to use 30% of the pot around 70% of the time. But there's a few points that we have to consider. First of all, we can actually just range bet on the very best flops, even from late positions. In late positions, we typically don't range bet, but if you simplify this to just one single bet size, you will see that the solver is betting almost 100% of the time. Just as a quick point, if I do go to the flop report, you will see that in button versus big blind, there is a lot of checking regardless of what the board height is. If we look over here, you'll notice that the solver is checking around 50% of the time, regardless of what that height is. But if it's a high disconnected board, then of course we're going to be doing a lot more betting. So it's a little bit rare to see a range bet from late positions, but King 7-3 is just overwhelmingly good. The main good factors that we're looking for is going to be a king on the flop. That's going to be absolutely amazing for our range. And then a big gap between all of these cards and no flush draw on the board. The very best boards are going to be your king high, super disconnected boards, exactly like this one. If we make the board even a little bit more connected, we'll do something like King 7-6, we will see that the checking frequency does go up. If you do simplify it down to just one bet size, the solver is going to bet like 80% of the time, so it's still probably more than fine to just range bet there. The very last note I have for you guys is that we are going to bet less often on ace-high flops. Same reasons as before, just know that it's there. I really like this quiz thing that I'm doing, so I want to ask you, what do you think is the overall betting frequency with your range here? We haven't talked about hand classes yet, so forget about that one. Just answer what's the betting frequency with your range. And of course, we're playing as button versus big blind here. Again, just forget about our hands for now. Pause the video, go. Okay, hopefully you had the chance to do that. I'm going to try answering it. I'm going to say betting around 80% of the time if we're simplifying down to one bet size. Might be a little bit lower here, but that's because it's going to use like some 50% bets here. Let's have a look. Oh, and it looks like I actually got it wrong. Here we are using overbets quite often, and we're not using as many small bets. That's kind of interesting. So I guess this qualifies a little bit more as a high connected board versus a high disconnected board, just because these first two cards are both quite high. If we change the 9 over to an 8, then this becomes a small bet. But there's a hard threshold between that 8 and a 9, where we're playing more overbets on the 9 and higher, and we're playing smaller bets if it's an 8 or lower. This is because both players actually have a lot of these 9x offsuit combos. So both players have a very different checking strategy with second pairs on King 9-3 versus King 8-3. And when you want to check a lot of second pairs, you typically want to play overbets on the flop. That's definitely a nice little piece of trivia. Just goes to show this sort of stuff can be incredibly deceiving. But regardless, let's just use King 8-3 as our board example, and let's talk about hand classes. Starting with our strongest hands, nothing has changed. We're still betting our strongest hands always, and our weaker top pairs are checking quite often. Going back here, our sets, our two pairs are doing the exact same thing, over pairs as well, and our weaker top pairs are going to be checking a lot. They are betting a little bit more often now that we're using a smaller bet size, because they're not really strong enough to overbet, but a small bet size suits them perfectly well. Going back to our weaker pairs, these combos are betting quite often now. They used to almost always check, now they are betting around 50% of the time. We're going to select under pairs, second pairs, third pairs, and low pairs, and see that all of these combos are just betting around 50% of the time. There's a few small patterns, like your second pairs are going to be betting a little bit more if they're stronger, Ace-8 is betting more than 10-8, for example. But overall, you can just simplify and really forget about this. You're not going to lose a lot of EV, trust me. Let's go back to our bluffs. Most of our weak junk or draws are always betting. High showdown value hands only bet around 30% of the time. Just selecting ace highs and no made hands, you'll see what I'm talking about. Anything that's pretty connected with either one of these cards is going to be betting a lot. So 5-4 is connected with the 3, the 9-7 is interacting a lot with the 8, the Jack-10, all these hands are interacting with the king, so they are betting very, very often. Obviously, flush draws are going to be betting a little bit more often. Jack-10 of spades is going to be betting more than Jack-10 of clubs, but all of these combos are betting at a high frequency. The only real air hands we have in our range that check a lot are going to be things like Ace-9 or Ace-7. These hands have too much showdown value to really bet, and they're not great bluffs. Again, we do see that overall concept where the less showdown value our hand has, the more often it's going to be bluffing. All right, so let's do a drill to seal the deal. We're holding Jack-9, button versus big blind. How often do we bet here? Let you guys pause it, think about it, write it down, go ahead. Okay, so hopefully you've done that. I'm gonna try my best. So Jack-9 obviously doesn't have any showdown value. And this combo is actually quite interesting because we interact both with that 8 and with the king, right? Because we can make a 9 through king straight and we can make a 9 through 8 straight. Sorry, I meant Jack through 7 straight there. So it's double connected. It doesn't have a showdown value. I'm going to say that this one's honestly just betting like 70% of the time because of that. Let's check it out. Okay, yeah, so even a little bit more often, but pretty much right on the money there. 70%, 80% doesn't really matter all that much. I'm sure many of you guys got the same answer. And with that said, let's move on to our next category. These will be the very, very fun low boards. Low boards are always very entertaining because they play very differently from early positions to late positions. As a general rule of thumb, we are going to bet 75% of the pot around 50% of the time. But this can vary a lot. Usually, we are going to bet smaller and less frequently from early positions. Here's a pretty good example. This tab shows the overall strategy for button versus big blind on 7-5 deuce rainbow. If I change the tab over to under the gun versus big blind, you will see that the overall betting frequency and bet size decreases. So just flipping between these two tabs, that's the difference. In late positions, both players' ranges are going to be a little bit wider, so top pairs are going to be worth a lot more. And the range asymmetry will decrease. So from late positions, your hands like Ace-7, King-7, and Queen-7 are super, super strong. In early positions, they're a little bit weaker, and your opponent has a lot more strong combos. Remember, their own range is quite condensed to a lot of these lower combos. And so those actually interact very, very well on those boards. You'll see that there's a lot of donking from earlier positions, and there's not quite as much from late positions on those boards. Here it's only 11% of the time. If you're playing against an opponent who doesn't even donk, you can just check at a very high frequency as under the gun. So if big blind's not donking, a lot of your hands get devalued because their checking range is quite strong, and so it's more than fine to even further decrease your bet size and then just check back a bunch. From early positions, if the board is disconnected, you can use around 40% of the pot, but from late positions, I would bet around 75% of the pot. And honestly, if the board is really disconnected, so something like 7-6 deuce, then from late positions, you can even just overbet. You would almost treat it as like that very first category we talked about. There's one more point, and it really goes hand in hand with what we just talked about. We should bet smaller and less often on more connected flops. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but if we switch this board out to 7-6-4 flush draw, for instance, then a lot of your strong hands become very weak, and the pre-flop caller is just going to have a pretty big range advantage. The overall bet size definitely decreases, and again, this is going to be another situation where big blind actually should donk very, very often. Again, if they don't do that, just check back here. Maybe exploitatively, you can just keep betting your strong hands. But again, more on exploits towards the end of the video. Okay, super fun stuff. Let's talk about hand classes. And for this example, we are going to use 9-6-4 flush draw because it's kind of in the middle. It's only a little bit connected, and from late positions, we can just bet 75% of the pot here. Let's start with our strong hands. Our 2 pairs plus are almost always betting just like before, but our over pairs and top pairs really care about that overall betting frequency. If you remember in that pro poker thought process, that was the first question we asked. And this is exactly why. So we want to think about the board factors first and how they affect the overall strategy before diving into hand classes. Overpairs, for example, are going to bet 50 to 90% of the time. On 964, our overpairs and top pairs are betting quite often, and we do prefer to bet the stronger ones or the more connected ones first. But if the board is more disconnected, you can bet those hands a lot more often. Still, top pairs are usually not going to bet more often than 50% of the time on average. Next, looking at our weak pairs. Second pairs are mainly checking, but stronger pairs can bet 50% of the time. Low pairs mainly check, but some weak pairs can bluff. Again, this depends a little bit on the overall strategy. If you're using 75% of the pot, you will see that your stronger second pairs bet, but your weaker ones aren't really strong enough in order to make that big bet. The same thing happens with the third pairs. They're usually checking, but if they're connected or if they're super strong, then I guess they can make that bet. But if we switch the board over to something a little bit more connected, like 764, because you're using a smaller bet here, it's actually okay to start betting a little bit more of your second pairs and third pairs. You can see that the frequency with hands like King 6 or Queen 6 increases when you're using a smaller bet size. So what's happening here on a very broad scale is that the board is more connected, so your stronger hands are worth less, you have a lot of weak hands that still want to bet, and therefore your weaker hands are just betting a little bit more using a small bet size, and then the stronger hands also have to fall into that small bet size. Because the responsibility of your strong hands is to protect your weak hands. You essentially have two different bet forces, and in this case, the small bet force wins and your weaker hands are just betting. Right, but I'm just going to go ahead and change the board back to 964, and let's look at our bluffs. Our draws are betting 70% of the time, weak overcards are betting 50% of the time, and air with showdown value checks. Just selecting the ace highs, king highs, and no mate hands, you will see that the strongest ace highs are always checking. Your draws are betting a little bit more, so if you have something like king 7 of spades, obviously that's a very nice bluff. But then you also have a lot of overcards on these boards, hands like queen jack, which still bet at a decent frequency. Something like 30 to 40% of the time is fine. Let's do a drill together. Jack 4, what do you guys do? PTV, pause that video. Hopefully you guys did that. This one I think is pretty straightforward. This is a weak pair. We're obviously not betting weak pairs very often. Maybe we're betting it like 20% of the time, but we'll just go for a check today. Yeah, not even 20%. We're just always checking here. I think that one's pretty straightforward. Let me know how you guys did. Let's move on to our final category. These are going to be paired boards. Before we look at some paired boards, I actually want to just cover the tips. So on paired boards, we want to bet 30% of the pot, 50 to 100% of the time. That's a pretty big range because it depends on a few factors. So first of all, we are betting far more often on high boards, especially from earlier positions. The reason why should be fairly intuitive at this point. There's a pretty big range asymmetry on high boards in early positions, so on something like King King 5, we can just bet 100% of the time for that small size. If we make the pair lower, because big blind will have more trips, our betting frequency is going to decrease, but our bet size is going to stay the same. Now, the reason why the bet size stays the same is because paired boards are actually quite difficult for both players to connect with. On something like 8-7-4, there's a whole lot of pairs that could be made. But I mean, like 2 of the 6s are already on the board, so it's kind of hard to make trips. And the only other card that you can really connect with is the 5. When both players just can't really make a lot of pairs, what happens is the pocket pairs become quite valuable. Even the weak pocket pairs do prefer to bet and got a lot of equity denial here. You will see that a small bet size is used because you're betting a lot of hands like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, pocket 9s, even pocket 4s and pocket 3s definitely benefit from denial. These weak pairs cannot overbet because they're not strong enough. So therefore, we're just using a small bet size with our range. I realize that I just talked about this point. We are betting less often on connected low boards, even from late positions. And let's just look at all the hand classes at once, because they really do vary depending on those factors. First of all, our trips are almost always betting. So even in under the gun versus big blind, whenever we do hold trips, we are betting 100% of the time here. There's very little slow playing happening. There's a few exceptions to this rule here and there, like for example on ace-king in button versus big blind, you will be checking a little bit more trips, but overall it's a pretty sound heuristic. But now let's look at everything else. Over pairs, top pairs, under pairs, and bluffs. All of these hands are betting 50 to 100% of the time, depending on that overall betting frequency. Again, that's why that was question 1. We have a few different priorities. For instance, with over pairs, The weaker the overpair is, the more denial it gets, therefore the more often it wants to bet. And you guys can definitely just pause the video, take a screenshot, read these over. But for the video, I think it's a bit more useful if we just do a case analysis. So here we are in button versus big blind on 10-10-5 rainbow. Our overall betting frequency is quite high because this is still a fairly high board. You will see that our under pairs and our second pairs and our third pairs are all betting at a very high frequency. Of course, the weaker second pairs and the third pairs are checking a tiny bit more. Most of our range are going to be ace highs, king highs, or no-made hands. Again, it's very difficult to interact with paired boards. Now, this is what's important. We see the similar pattern where the less showdown value our combos have and the more connected they are, the more they prefer to bet. Queen deuce suited is betting a lot more often than ace deuce suited because ace deuce just has more showdown value. But here things get a little bit different. From late positions only, you can actually make a value bet with your strongest air. So hands like ace king and ace queen really do like value betting now. Again, it's so hard for our opponent to have anything. This is a strong hand. If you think about it, hands like ace king and ace queen also get a ton of equity denial because they are not made pairs yet. So even on like an 8 or a 7 turn, our opponents are going to improve to some pairs which do beat these hands. So it's very important for them to bet now. In early positions, these hands don't have as much showdown value. So this is pretty much just a button versus big blind thing. Let's do a quiz. How often are you betting here? Pause the video. Honestly, at this point in the video, if you did that, then massive props to you. You're a legend. But let me go ahead and just try it out. So obviously we're going to be betting super often. We know our betting frequency on this board with our entire range is like 70%. So I'll just say that we're going to bet this combo around 70% of the time. Okay, so I forgot to press this button again, but yeah, you can see we're betting around 70% of the time. I guess 60 is a bit more accurate, but again, it doesn't matter. When you're doing drills, if you're even within like 20% of the overall frequency, that's good enough for me. Okay, my friends, we are finally here. Now that we have answered the first two questions, we can get into the real fun stuff. That is question 3. What is the exploitative way to play? We know what the Nash strategy looks like on a number of flops. Now we want to know which way we should deviate in order to maximally exploit our opponents and actually crush them. And this is a question that I usually answer in my private coaching because it warrants its own separate discussion. But I promise to let you guys know in this video. So on the flop, usually the best way for us to exploit our opponents is to bet more often with our strong hands and check a bit more often with our bluffs. This is so important because most people make the mistake of betting their bluffs too often on the flop. I'm not going to dive into the specifics for why, but our bluffs prefer to actually check on the flop because our opponents will fold a lot more often versus our delayed c-bet and our check bet line. In my private coaching, I structure everything based on some math which explains why. There's a website on my video that discusses this a little bit more in depth, but in general, people are just going to be folding a lot more often if you check on the flop. So despite what most people do, you should check on the flop more often with your bluffs. But really, this only gets us so far. And I want to dive into a spot to explain why, and then I'll actually walk you guys through some hands. So let's say you're playing as button versus big blind on 10-10-5. As we talked about earlier, most of our range is going to miss this flop. The majority of our range will be bluffs. Exploitatively, it's better for us to check our bluffs on the flop. But if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, then obviously you cannot check all of your bluffs on the flop. You have so many of them that if you were to actually check all of these hands, your overall betting frequency would decrease to something like 30%. If you're playing against any competent opponent, they will notice that you're not betting often enough on the flop, and therefore they're going to correctly assume that most of your bluffs are checking. So what we want to do is we want to decrease how often we bet our bluffs without eliminating that bet option entirely. So we still want to bet them sometimes. And the general rule of thumb advice that I give to people is that you want to increase the checking frequency with your bluffs by around 20 to 30%. So this means that when you're holding something like ace-7 suited, you can see that the solver is betting it around 70% of the time. You just want to check it an additional 30%. So you're still betting it sometimes. This keeps you looking reasonable, but you're exploiting your opponents. This is a strategy that simply works at high stakes. When you're on the other end of this, it sucks. Your opponents will not know what hit them, but implementing it is quite difficult. The reason why is because you need to know what the baseline looks like in order for you to deviate. You need to know how often these hands are betting before you start adjusting the betting frequency. If you don't know what the solver strategy looks like on this board, then how can you possibly deviate in such a way? Therefore, you need to know theory in order to exploit your opponents. But let's go ahead and walk through my thought process. And here we're trying to figure out how often we want to check with our hand in order to maximally exploit our opponents. To get here, we just need to answer our questions. The first question is, what is our overall betting frequency here? The second question is, what is the overall betting frequency with your hand? And then the third question is, how often do you want to bet your hand if you're going to check it 30% more often, right? So first you want to understand the betting frequency with your hand, and then you just want to say what is 30% below that frequency. And that's how often you want to bet it. Obviously, you guys can just pause the video. Let's start with that first question. What is the overall betting frequency? This is a high disconnected board. You know, the 5 and the 4 are a little bit more connected, so that's not great for our overall betting frequency. But in general, we're still probably going to be betting this quite often. I would say that we're using a small bet size and we're going to be betting around 60 to 70% of the time. Next up, what is our overall betting frequency with our hand? Remember, our hand does not have a lot of showdown value, and it's a little bit connected with that queen, which is one of the things we looked out for. So I'm going to assume that our hand is betting around 60% of the time. And then to exploit our opponents, I would simply bet it maybe 20 or 30% of the time. So let's check it out. I really love seeing that. Okay, so starting with our overall betting frequency, yeah, if we simplify it down to one bet size, which is the small bet size, we would be betting around 60 to 70% of the time. Our specific combo is betting quite often. And so by only betting it around 20 to 30% of the time, we are checking this hand more often, and then we're going to bluff it later in the hand. And this is it. This is the golden high stakes poker thought process. This is how you absolutely crush. I hope you guys really enjoyed the video. Let me know and I'll make so many more of these. This has been so much fun. This has been Chai. I will see you in the next one.